Alright, you primitive screwheads, listen up. Welcome to Dark Arts and Entertainment, Grimm's Tales from Japan and the Far East. I am your host, Eric, the Brother Grimm Drummond. Now, in today's episode, the gloves are off. Alright, now, I know that a lot of times certain best ofs are very subjective. Most hauntings, for example, or the most haunted place, or the most active paranormal place. We see it all the time, especially those of us who watch the ghost shows that are all over TV nowadays. The most haunted place in blank, and then they go there and nothing happens. Repeatedly, show after show, each different person that keeps doing these things, nothing ever happens at the most haunted, quote-unquote, place in blank. Yet, the same show will go to a house out in the suburbs somewhere and the gates of hell open up. Well, here in Japan, we have a lot of places that are purportedly haunted, that are like the most haunted place in Japan, or the most haunted place in lore, or the most sacred place, the holiest place, the most active place, the scariest place, and so on and so forth. But what I'm going to talk about today is pretty indisputable. And it's definitely got one of the more unique stories behind it. If you haven't heard of it, I'm not surprised. Very few people have. What I'm talking about today is what is arguably the most cursed place in all of Japan. Now, first off, to understand about this is the location. We're not talking about someplace in an ancient shrine or out in the middle of the forest. We've all heard of the haunted forest, and maybe one of these days I'll do a show on that. But maybe not, because believe it or not, I think that place is actually fairly overrated, I should say. In other words, I'm not as enamored with the whole haunted forest place in Japan as a lot of people seem to be. I was a little more enamored with what's sometimes considered the most sacred place in Japan, and that is the Izumo Taisha, the Izumo Shrine, out in the Shimane Prefecture. The oldest shrine in Japan. So old that they actually don't know how old it is. And that was a place of profound peace and tranquility. You could just breathe it in. It was wonderful. So what we're actually going to do today is exactly the opposite. We're going to talk about the most profoundly accursed and unhappy place in Japan to disturb. It is a grave, and it is a grave that is in the absolute heart of downtown Tokyo. In fact, it is within rock-throwing distance of the Imperial Palace itself. It's all about the story of a samurai from the Warring States period named Taira Masakado. We're talking about a story that dates back to about the year 940 AD. Masakado was a samurai who was, for reasons which aren't important to today's topic, because I don't want to give a history lesson, I'm going to get right down to the chase here. But for reasons mostly personal, he led a rebellion. And Masakado himself was known as a hothead. Very proficient in martial prowess, extremely good warrior, but also very, very easy to anger, prone to emotion. And due to a personal situation involving his family, he led a march on Kyoto itself. A rebellion that not only was targeted to avenge the slight to his family, but he decided to take it a few steps further. Masakado decided to overthrow the emperor and become the new emperor himself. Well, obviously this was met with resistance. Now, this was prior to the Tokugawa era, so this was the Warring States period. Things like this were actually not all that uncommon. Rebellions happened all the time. Neighbor went to war with neighbor. Sometimes there were clans of samurai who would go to war in order to train some of their newer people. You know, how do you practice killing people with swords unless you actually start killing people with swords? So that's what they did. Japan was in a state of chaos at this time anyway. One of the few things that held Japan together was the emperor and the belief in the divinity of the emperor. And when Masakado led his rebellion against the emperor, well, it was not met well, let's just put it that way. In battle, he finally was defeated. Him and about 200 of his followers dead, and the rest of his followers scattered, and most of them eventually hunted down. But the head of Masakado was brought back to Kyoto, because it was still Kyoto at the time where the capital was. Marched through the city and hung up above a market square for all the people to see that this is what happens when you cross the Emperor of Japan. But that's not where it ended. When Kyoto displayed Masakado's head, strange things started happening. People would hear that the head would actually open its eyes or gnash its teeth. And then one day, the head just decided to vanish. There were reports, unconfirmed reports, that say that somebody came along, an archer came along, and due to his hatred of Masakado, the archer shot an arrow at the head, hit the head, and the head popped off of the place in the market where it was tied to and rolled away and was never seen again. Or at least for a few weeks. Because the head was apparently fairly restless. About 3 weeks later, a little town which was located far away from Kyoto, what is now one of the districts of Tokyo, discovered a head showed up. Out of nowhere. Now, there wasn't exactly evening news and the internet back then in Japan, but word gets out. And word traveled faster than apparently this head did, because the people of this area of Tokyo concluded that this must be the head of Masakado. They buried the head, and then all kinds of nightmares started breaking loose after that. Storms came in, black as night storms in the middle of the day. An earthquake occurred, and people claimed that they saw images when the lightning flashed of the storm of an unknown warrior standing in the middle of the street, staring and glaring at people. The monks and the Omnioji were called in. They tried their best to placate the spirit of Masakado, but nothing that they did ever worked. Trouble started plaguing the village, and so the exorcist, the spiritual specialist, the occultist called Omnioji, decided to take a different track. Instead of trying to weaken the spirit and placate the spirit and trying to make it softer and calmer, they did the exact opposite. What they did for Masakado in order to get him to calm down is they elevated him. They used their rituals to erect a shrine, bury the head under the shrine, and give Masakado's spirit a divinity sense. Now, if you've never seen one of my YouTube videos, I do a video on what the yurei is in Japan. I'm not going to go over the entire video, but one of the important parts of it here is, in Japanese belief, the human spirit is powerful enough to be considered divine. That within us all is the power of a kami, the power of a demigod. The body here on this plane keeps all that power in check, acts much like a restrictor plate in a car does. And when the body's no longer there, the plate is removed. So what the Onmyoji decided to do was inject more energy into Masakado's spirit to release him by making him something as divine as possible. It's one of the reasons that the divine leave the mortal world alone is because they're busy doing God stuff, and they don't have time to care about wretched human stuff. So they basically made Masakado into a god. And when they did this, through their worship and their rituals, and regular immaculate care of his grave and shrine, the troubles stopped. The village became peaceful and quiet once again, and was left relatively alone for the rest of its existence. Fast forward to the Edo period. The Tokugawa Bafuku, when it moved to Tokyo, set up the Imperial Palace, coincidentally, if you believe in such things, right near the grave of Masakado and his shrine. And they decided to leave the shrine be, at least for a while. But eventually they decided, well, let's move this unsightly grave, since we don't even know really who it is. And so they decided to dig it up. This apparently was a mistake. The first thing that they noticed is when they dug up the grave is that inside, underneath the ground, was a stone chamber with nothing in it. No head. Once again, the head seemed to have vanished. So they concluded, all right, no harm, no foul. Let's move all of this stuff. And that's when the earthquake started. The fires happened all around town. Screams were heard in the middle of the night, and banging occurred all over the village itself and the townspeople, as well as inside the imperial palace. The emperor decided that maybe disturbing the shrine was not a good idea. So even with an empty grave under the shrine, he ordered it rebuilt. The priests, the monks, decided to come back in. They took care of the shrine every day, made it offerings, gave prayers to it, and the troubles stopped. Fast forward. 20th century, end of World War II. The American occupation of Japan began. The emperor and the new government of Japan was being reformed once again. Tokyo had grown immensely over these years into a modern-day city. And one of the things the Americans were doing was renovating some of the areas around it. And that includes this shrine. They actually ordered the shrine destroyed in order to make way for buildings, specifically government buildings for ministries, I believe of finance, if I'm not mistaken. I don't have that note in front of me. A bulldozer, about the year 1948 or so, circa 1948, smashed into the gravestone of Masakado's grave, bent it over, and tilted it. And the bulldozer itself tilted over and over until it crashed, toppling over onto itself and killing the driver. Japan and the Japanese negotiated with the Americans, and they lost. Buildings were built, and that's when the troubles began again. With no one taking care of this grave and people trying to build buildings over it, dozens of construction workers died. Many more were injured, to the point where the entire project got scrapped, and Masakado's shrine and grave was ordered to be rebuilt. The priest once again moved in to take care of the grave, and the troubles stopped. To this very day, those finance offices and ministry offices of the government were built about a block away from the planned site over the shrine. And to this very day, the workers in the offices carefully arrange their desks to make sure that their backs are never towards the shrine. You can go to this grave right now. It is open to the public. It is a shrine like any other. And you will notice that it is in exceptionally good condition. As to this day, the priests take very good care of it. People pay homage to it, and it is an eerie silence about this grave. Even chatty tourists who don't exactly follow the local customs of remaining silent amongst the gravestones, they head here and for some strange reason just enjoy the moment. And they don't talk very much. The grave of Masakado, roughly translated as the grave of the head, is the one where you will probably be also admonished the most for disturbing. Not because of rights of being polite, but because people to this day genuinely fear angering Masakado's spirit. So if you do fancy a trip to the Imperial Palace someday, take a trip. Look for this little shrine with a sacred grave, albeit empty grave, underneath it. And whatever you do, be polite. As it said, Masakado really does not take kindly to being offended. It wouldn't hurt to donate to the local omnioji and priests that take very, very good care of this grave. The Japanese, one of the hallmarks of Japan is their emphasis on ceremonial burial and care of a grave is one of the reasons that there's actually not all that much haunted activity reported here in Japan. Many people say that the better a grave is taken care of, well, the more at rest the spirits will be. And Japan is very loyal about that, especially when that spirit has said to kill many, many people through earthquakes, storms, and other subsequent accidents, all because they don't want their grave disturbed. Have a look sometime, and be respectful. That was today's story, one that I dug up myself, and again, if you have any stories, I want to hear them. Same with questions. Please contact me anytime here on this channel that you're watching, or listening, rather, on this on, and message me. I would love to hear your stories, and maybe even put some of them on the air. So until next time, I am Eric the Brother Grimm Drummond. Thank you for listening to Dark Arts and Entertainment, Grimm's Tales of Japan and the Far East. And remember, some mysteries are not meant to be solved. They're meant to be savored. Thank you, and good night.